They say some families carry shadows that never leave, secrets buried so deep that even the land around them seems to mourn. The Whitakers were one such family, their story hidden behind the quiet hills of rural Virginia, a lineage whispered about but never spoken of in daylight. From the moment you step into their history, you feel the weight of a curse that clings not to houses or heirlooms, but to the blood itself. There are whispers that the very soil they walked upon seemed tainted, fertile with something unnatural, something the world wasn't meant to witness. Hello everyone, before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The first records of the Whitaker family date back to the late 1700s, and even then, neighbors described strange patterns in the family's life. Children born with uncanny resemblance to one another, illnesses that defied explanation, and an unshakable isolation that cut them from the wider community. They lived on the outskirts of towns, their homes shadowed beneath thick oak trees, as if nature itself tried to contain the darkness they carried. Some villagers claimed that no laughter ever escaped the Whitaker estate, only hushed voices and the sound of doors closing behind invisible footsteps. Generations seemed trapped in repetition, early deaths, mental anguish, and marriages that carried a peculiar weight. It wasn't just misfortune, locals insisted. It was something inherited, a kind of malevolent legacy that clung to anyone who bore the Whitaker name. The family was secretive, protective of their own, and yet they could not hide the signs of their unraveling. Neighbors spoke in careful tones, their fear palpable, recounting incidents that seemed almost folkloric, a child staring at the corner of a room as if seeing through the walls, or a family member suddenly collapsing in silent hysteria with no cause. What makes the Whitakers remarkable and terrifying is that this pattern continued for centuries. The deeper you dig, the more unsettling the evidence becomes. Letters, diaries, and medical records paint a picture of a family that seemed cursed by their own genetics, yes, but perhaps by something far older than even their own founding ancestors. Some historians suggest that the Whitakers were part of a network of interrelated families, keeping bloodlines strictly insular, believing that purity of lineage was a sacred act. What they didn't know, or perhaps ignored, was that such insularity carries a price that history rarely forgives. By the mid-1800s, the Whitaker name had become synonymous with tragedy. One generation saw children born with deformities, another with minds unhinged. Journals of the time revealed the chilling resignation of mothers, documenting birth after birth, each one more afflicted than the last. Yet the family persisted stubbornly, almost ritualistically, refusing to seek help or step beyond the walls of their isolation. And as the 20th century arrived, the patterns, horrifyingly predictable, remained. Those who were born into this lineage were born into suffering, born into secrets that would shape them before they even learned to walk. There is a weight to understanding the Whitakers, a gravity that is hard to shake. To study them is to peer into a mirror of human obsession with blood and inheritance, a mirror that reflects not just familial loyalty, but the profound horror of repeating mistakes over centuries. And yet, despite every warning in their history, the world looks on and wonders, could a family truly be cursed by something as intangible, as invisible as the sins of their own ancestors? The origins of the Whitaker curse are as murky as the family's own records. Some say it began with Jeremiah Whitaker, the patriarch who arrived in Virginia in the late 1700s, carrying with him a determination that bordered on obsession. He was meticulous in keeping his lineage pure, marrying within a narrow circle of families that shared his last name. At first, neighbors saw nothing unusual, just a man devoted to tradition. But over time, the consequences of such isolation began to manifest in ways that could not be explained away as coincidence. Medical accounts, sparse as they were, hint at conditions that modern science would label as genetic anomalies. But in those days, the explanations were superstitious at best. Children were born with deformities, with eyes that seemed too large or hands that refused to grasp normally. Still, the Whitakers pressed on, each generation marrying cousins or distant relatives, convinced that they were safeguarding something sacred in their bloodline. Yet the result was increasingly grotesque, each birth echoing the horrors of the last, as though some invisible hand ensured that the curse would not be broken. What makes the Whitaker story different from other isolated families is their meticulous self-documentation. Diaries, letters, and scraps of parchment survive to this day, filled with painstaking records of births, illnesses, and deaths. One can almost feel the desperation inked into those pages, the quiet panic of mothers and fathers who knew that their children would not live normal lives, yet pressed forward regardless. Jeremiah himself noted, in a rare moment of clarity, that the family seemed marked by a fate beyond understanding, though he did not live to see the full scope of the suffering that would follow. As the decades passed, the Whitakers withdrew even further from society. Local townspeople spoke of the family almost like they were specters. Lights flickered behind curtained windows at odd hours, doors would creak open and close without explanation, and the children, strange and silent, roamed the estates like shadows. There were stories, perhaps exaggerated over time, of entire rooms that smelled of decay despite the absence of illness, and whispers of rituals that outsiders were too afraid to ask about. The Whitakers existed in a space between life and legend, one foot in the human world and one in something far older, far darker. Some historians argue that the true horror of the Whitakers is not merely their inbreeding, not merely their repeated tragedies, but the psychological toll they inflicted on themselves. Diaries reveal parents torn between love and horror, documenting their children with both affection and fear, unable to reconcile the bond of blood with the weight of inherited suffering. Each generation seemed to sense the inevitability of what was to come, yet they could not stop it. It was as though the family itself conspired to perpetuate the curse, not through malice, but through a combination of tradition, isolation, and blind devotion. By the turn of the 20th century, the Whitaker family had become a cautionary tale whispered in surrounding communities. Doctors refused to examine their children for fear of what they might discover, and neighbors gave them wide berth, unsure if the family's misfortunes were natural or the result of something far more sinister. And yet, the Whitakers endured. They persisted, not in spite of the curse, but alongside it, living proof of the price that obsession and secrecy can extract from a family over centuries. The 20th century brought the Whitakers into sharper focus, though always from the shadows. Unlike other families, whose misfortunes faded into obscurity, the Whitakers' struggles were documented with a precision that bordered on obsession. Every birth, every death, every illness was recorded as though it were part of a ledger of human suffering. And the patterns were undeniable. Children born with unusual physical traits, or minds so fragile they could not function in the world outside the estate, became the norm rather than the exception. The family's isolation was no longer simply geographical. It was psychological, almost ritualistic, a fortress built against a world that could never understand them. By mid-century, local historians and medical professionals began to take notice, though few dared approach the estate directly. Letters sent by doctors report conditions that defied explanation, extreme cases of deformity, unpredictable bouts of violence, and cognitive impairments that could not be traced to any known disease. One particularly chilling diary entry, dated 1934, describes a child who refused to eat, whispering constantly to someone no one else could see. The mother writes with trembling hands, acknowledging the child's suffering but powerless to intervene. And yet, she continues to have children, each one inheriting the cruel lottery of the Whitaker bloodline. What makes these accounts so unsettling is the absence of malice. There is no evidence of deliberate harm, no suggestion that the family sought to punish itself. Instead, there is a quiet, relentless inevitability, as if the curse existed outside the family's control, waiting patiently to assert itself in each generation. Some scholars suggest that this is the true horror of the Whitakers, not any single act of cruelty, but the slow, inexorable repetition of suffering generation after generation, until it becomes indistinguishable from fate. There are stories from neighbors that hint at something beyond genetics, something far darker. A local farmer recalls seeing a Whitaker child standing at the edge of the woods, staring for hours without blinking, as though waiting for something, or someone, to appear. Another recalls hearing music from the estate late at night, soft and discordant, though no instrument could be found. These accounts may seem folkloric, but when combined with the family records, a pattern emerges. The Whitakers were not merely haunted by their biology, but by the weight of secrets too profound to speak aloud. And yet, despite everything, the family persisted. Their children were born, lived, and sometimes died in silence. Letters reveal parents caught in cycles of hope and despair, documenting each birth as if it were a gamble with unseen odds. Friends and outsiders rarely intervened. The estate was a fortress of quiet horror, a place where the world's compassion was too late to reach. Even today, the Whitaker estate sits in relative obscurity, a monument to human obsession, to inherited suffering, and to the quiet horror that can dwell in a single family's bloodline. By now, it becomes impossible to separate the human from the monstrous. The Whitakers are neither fully tragic nor fully villainous. They are something in between, a living testament to the fragility of life and the unforgiving nature of inheritance. And as we dig deeper, as we pull back the layers of time, we begin to see that the true terror lies not in any single story, but in the pattern itself, a family trapped in repetition, unable to escape the shadow that has pursued them for centuries. As the decades progressed, the Whitakers' reputation became more than a whisper. It became a cautionary tale, a shadow that hung over the surrounding communities. Outsiders spoke of them with a mixture of fear and fascination, convinced that the family carried not just bad luck, but a presence that seemed to linger long after anyone had left their estates. Visitors who were brave enough to approach often described a feeling of suffocation, an almost tangible weight pressing against them, as if the house itself were mourning centuries of sorrow and secrecy. The family's own records reveal a growing awareness of the darkness they carried. By the 1950s, letters and diaries show parents grappling with the inevitability of their children inheriting not just physical maladies, but profound psychological disturbances. One mother writes that she feels as though the blood itself is tainted with despair, a haunting admission of the helplessness that defined life inside the Whitaker household. There are references to children whispering to unseen entities, to objects moving without explanation, and to inexplicable sounds in the night. For outsiders, these accounts seemed fantastical, but to the Whitakers, they were simply the continuation of an inherited legacy, a family narrative as old as the trees that shadowed their home. Some historians suggest that this psychological isolation compounded the biological toll. The family's insularity created a world where every fear, every anomaly, was amplified by proximity. Children were raised in constant awareness of the family curse, and parents, though desperate to protect them, often inadvertently reinforced it. Letters reveal moments of tenderness, but also despair, as parents watched their children struggle, powerless to change what seemed destined by blood. In a sense, the Whitakers became prisoners of themselves, bound not by walls or chains, but by generations of inherited trauma. There are unsettling anecdotes of the era that remain chilling to this day. A mid-century neighbor recounts seeing a young Whitaker child standing perfectly still in the yard for hours, eyes wide and unblinking, murmuring words that made no sense to anyone but the family. Another tells of lights flickering in rooms with no electricity, doors opening on their own, and laughter that sometimes turned to shrieks without cause. Some dismissed these stories as folklore, but when cross-referenced with diaries and letters, a darker pattern emerges. The family's suffering was not only biological or psychological, it was experiential, manifesting in ways that defied rational explanation. By the late 20th century, the Whitakers had become almost invisible. The towns around them continued, life moving forward, while the family remained suspended in their own reality, a shadow frozen in time. Researchers who managed to gain access to some of the private records speak of an oppressive atmosphere of grief inked into every page and of the inescapable repetition of tragedy. They describe a family that, though human, seems to have been designed to endure suffering in ways that most could not comprehend. And in studying them, one cannot help but wonder, is it simply genetics, or is there something more, something ancestral, almost metaphysical, that clings to the Whitaker name? By the 1980s, the Whitaker family had become an enigma, both feared and pitied by the outside world. Their isolation was almost complete, yet fragments of their lives continued to leak into local folklore. Some accounts describe entire rooms left untouched for decades, filled with toys, clothes, and journals that seemed frozen in time. Others tell of voices whispering through the halls late at night, as though the house itself remembered the generations that had suffered within it. For anyone daring enough to explore these stories, the line between fact and legend begins to blur, leaving only a lingering sense of dread. Medical professionals who examined descendants of the Whitaker bloodline often spoke of extraordinary anomalies. Children exhibited physical malformations and cognitive impairments beyond what would normally be expected from inbreeding alone. Some seemed aware of their own difference, withdrawing into themselves, whispering to unseen companions, or staring at corners of rooms where no one else could see. The patterns were so consistent that it suggested something beyond mere genetics, a psychological inheritance, a mental echo of centuries of trauma. The Whitakers were, in essence, born into a story they never chose, a narrative of suffering they could not escape. Even within the family, there were moments of haunting self-awareness. Letters from the late 1970s show parents acknowledging the curse in private correspondence, though they felt powerless to act. One entry reads, "We live not as a family but as witnesses to our own undoing." There is a sense in these writings of quiet horror, of a resignation so profound that hope itself seems futile. The Whitakers understood that their choices could not alter the inevitable path of their children's lives, and yet, bound by tradition, they pressed on generation after generation, weaving tragedy into the very fabric of their family. And yet, despite the weight of history, the human instinct for survival persisted. Children were born, educated at home, and nurtured with care, even as the shadows of their lineage loomed. The family became adept at hiding the grotesque patterns from outsiders, maintaining a fragile veneer of normalcy, while the curse continued its slow, relentless work. Their story is a grim reminder that evil is not always explosive or overt. It often whispers, insinuates itself into the mundane, and grows quietly over decades until it becomes impossible to ignore. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The Whitakers lived with this question every day, unable to answer it, forced to confront the consequences of choices made centuries before their time. In studying them, one begins to grasp the complexity of inherited suffering, not just as a biological fact, but as a psychological reality that shapes every thought, every decision, every moment of existence. The Whitakers were prisoners of their own history, and through them, we glimpse the dark potential hidden within all human lineage. As the Whitaker story moved into the late 20th and early 21st centuries, it became clear that the curse, or whatever force had gripped the family, was far from broken. Modern descendants carried the weight of centuries, and though some attempts at intervention were made, the patterns proved stubbornly persistent. Even with access to modern medicine, genetic counseling, and psychological support, the family continued to manifest signs of the same anomalies, both physical and mental, that had plagued them for generations. It is as if the Whitaker bloodline itself resisted change, insisting on repeating the story that had begun hundreds of years before. The family archives reveal an obsessive awareness of their own legacy. Diaries meticulously document each child's development, every illness, and every odd behavior, creating a chilling longitudinal record that few families have ever dared to compile. These records are at once a cry for help and a testament to resignation. In one journal, a parent writes, "We have loved and failed in equal measure. The blood teaches what the heart cannot unlearn." Reading these words, one begins to understand that the Whitakers' tragedy is not just biological. It is existential. They are trapped in an inherited nightmare, aware of the horror yet powerless to escape it. There are also darker, more unsettling accounts from outsiders who have encountered the family in recent decades. Neighbors speak of children who seem impossibly still, standing silently in yards or staring through windows as though they are observing another plane of existence. Stories circulate of voices echoing from empty rooms, and some who have spent time on the property report a sense of oppressive grief, an emotional weight that is almost physical. The Whitakers, in essence, carry not only their own suffering, but the accumulated anguish of generations before them. Every heartbeat is a reminder of history repeating itself. And yet, the Whitakers are not simply victims. Within the family, there is resilience and almost desperate ingenuity in maintaining life under the shadow of their legacy. They adapt, they survive, they continue the cycle of living even as they confront the inevitable. This duality, the coexistence of suffering and survival, is what makes their story so haunting. We are left to wonder, is it merely fate, biology, or something else entirely that has allowed the Whitakers to endure despite the darkness that defines them? Perhaps it is a combination of all, a living record of humanity's capacity for both obsession and perseverance. The Whitakers force us to confront uncomfortable questions. How much of who we are is dictated by our lineage? Can a family truly inherit more than just genes? Can they inherit destiny, tragedy, even a curse? In studying the Whitakers, we see not just a family in isolation, but a mirror for the hidden, unspoken forces that shape human existence. And as the sun sets over the old estates, casting long shadows across the land, one cannot help but feel that some stories were never meant to end, some legacies never meant to be broken, and some curses are carried silently from generation to generation like an unspoken oath. Today, the Whitaker name still exists, though few outside the family truly know of its burden. The estates remain largely abandoned, the houses standing as silent witnesses to centuries of sorrow. Modern descendants live quietly, often separated from one another, carrying with them the echoes of a past that cannot be undone. Yet the imprint of the family's history is undeniable, etched into their very beings. Each generation is a testament to endurance, but also a warning of what can happen when secrecy, obsession, and isolation converge over centuries. The archives, diaries, and letters preserved by the family provide a haunting window into this world. They speak not only of physical ailments or cognitive struggles, but of the psychological weight that defined everyday life. Parents wrote of the despair they could not lift, of children they could not protect, and of a legacy that seemed both sacred and damning. The Whitakers were acutely aware of their own history, yet bound to it in ways that science, reason, or time could never fully liberate. Their story challenges our understanding of inheritance, not merely as biology, but as the slow accumulation of trauma, choices, and silence across generations. And perhaps that is the most chilling truth of all. The Whitakers remind us that the human capacity for suffering is not always external. It can be inherited, passed down quietly through blood, environment, and secrecy. The horror is not always immediate or explosive. Sometimes it is a slow, relentless pressure, shaping lives in ways invisible to the outside world. To study the Whitakers is to confront that reality, to realize that history is never neutral, and that the past can live on in the most intimate and unforgiving ways. As the sun sets over the rural hills where the Whitakers once dominated the landscape, we are left with a stark truth: some families carry shadows that never lift. Their lives, their choices, and their suffering are interwoven with the land and the memory of those who came before. The Whitakers were not monsters, nor were they saints. They were human, trapped in a cycle of legacy and consequence that few could escape. And yet, in their endurance, there is a haunting lesson: the past is never truly gone, and some secrets, once unearthed, refuse to stay buried. The Whitaker family's story forces us to question what we inherit beyond our genes, the emotional weight, the decisions, and the secrets that can shape not just a life, but the lives of generations to come. To peer into their history is to peer into a mirror, reflecting the fragility of our own existence and the shadows that might dwell quietly in the corners of every family. Some stories are never meant to be told, some curses are never meant to be broken, and some truths are so unsettling, so profound, that only the bravest among us dare to confront them, even from a distance.